we're still obviously looking at Borg and Crossan's book called The First Paul. We've been looking at the chapter entitled The Life of a Long Distance Apostle. And I've really appreciated this chapter because, I've read the book before, but, it's like every time you read a book, you pick up something new. And I've really appreciated the way Borg and Crossan have broken down Paul's missionary journeys. And when I was in seminary, you hear that Paul usually has 3 missionary journeys. One that he takes with Barnabas, the next one that he takes after the Jerusalem Council, and then a 3rd missionary journey. Borg and Crossan actually call Paul's first missionary journey, and it can be kind of confusing because if you look in the back of your Bible, if you have a study Bible, it will have 1st, 2nd, and 3rd missionary journeys, and they will correspond with those that I just mentioned. 1st with Barnabas, 2nd after the Jerusalem Council, and so on. But they really make a very strong argument that Paul's first missionary journey was to the Nabatean kingdom that includes the city of Petra, what we might call the Nabatean mission there. And last time we talked about why it was that journey was not successful, and it really had to do with political reasons. Paul made the questionable decision to go to that area of the world in present day Jordan, in the midst of a conflict between the Nabatean king Aretas IV and Herod Antipas, and all over Herod's basically shunning the Aretas's daughter and marrying a Hasmonean princess named Herodias, and from there things just kind of fell apart. So in the midst of this, Paul goes down to Petra and those areas, and was probably recognized as a Judean or as a Jew coming from or at least having some ties to the to the enemy, so to speak. And so Borg and Crossan, their thesis is that Paul's journey or mission there was just unsuccessful, and he probably ran away with his tail between his legs. But then after that, Paul spent 14 years in Tarsus, and then he was called by Barnabas to come back and begin that mission that has traditionally been called his first missionary journey under the auspices of the Antiochene church. And you might remember, you might remember our map here. You've got Jerusalem down here, the Dead Sea. Go a little bit north, the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus, this area of Nazareth Galilee and Nazareth, where Jesus was raised. And you go on up to present day Antakya, Syria, or Antioch, a very ancient city. This is the place where Paul's traditional first missionary journey comes from. And Paul was under the care of Barnabas. And Borg and Crossan make the point, and they made it quite well, I thought, that when we read about Paul, we usually have 2 sources. We have the authentic letters of Paul himself, and in this case, the focus has been on Galatians, because this is a place where Paul gives a lot of biographical detail. I shouldn't say in great detail, but he gives some biographical insights. Galatians probably written somewhere, between 50 and 60 of the Common Era. And then a later what we might call a historical document, written by Luke. Luke, who also wrote the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles as a kind of narrative going from Jesus all the way to Paul's trip to Rome, where we know that he was eventually executed. But the problem is that there's some discrepancies between how Luke sees things and how Paul sees things. And it was this discrepancy, and these discrepancies, I should say, that Borg and Crossan pick up on in this chapter, and specifically discussions of something that in the Acts of the Apostles, Luke calls the Jerusalem Council. And this is where we left off last time. But I do want to make this comment also that when Luke was writing his history, the Acts of the Apostles, he probably did not have much firsthand knowledge of Paul's second and third missionary journey as they are traditionally known. He probably wrote about Paul's trips to Philippi, Thessalonica, Corinth, Ephesus, using the model of the first missionary journey, which was, a journey that Paul took with his, might even say mentor, Barnabas. And Borg and Crossan make it clear that Luke probably knew a lot about that first Barnabas mission, which was really just kind of a short jaunt around present-day Turkey, known then as Galatia. But he probably didn't know a whole lot about the second and the third missionary journey. So he uses the Barnabas mission as a model to write about Paul's later missionary journeys. And this is, here's our friend Joyce. And so this brings us to the turning point, really, where Paul, I want to welcome Joyce if she's in. Hello, Joyce. Glad to see you. Glad you can make it. So this brings us to the turning point where Paul has a break with Barnabas and he goes his own way. What was the cause of that breach? And Luke writes about it in Acts. And of course, Paul alludes to it in his letter to the Gentiles. And what was happening at this time, remember, it's just 2 decades after Jesus has been crucified. And you have basically barely literate apostles, Peter, James, and John, leading the church. And they are really promoting Jesus as a Jewish Messiah, right? And a Jewish Messiah who nevertheless is opening the world to the Gentiles. But remember, their understanding of Jesus was very, very Jewish. So the question arises, okay, well, a Gentile must, if a Gentile man, for example, wants to come and be a part of the Christian tradition, wants to affirm Jesus as Lord and Savior, as the Jewish Messiah who opens the door to the Gentiles as well, what must that person do? Well, it seems clear that if you're going to, it at least seemed clear to Peter, James, and John, if you're going to pass into an affirmation of the Jewish Messiah, Jesus, then you first have to become Jewish, and then you have to affirm all of the nuances of Jesus as a Jewish Messiah that aren't present in the traditional Jewish understanding of the Messiah. You have to get circumcised, right? And that seemed to Paul to be beyond the pale, right? If Jesus is truly the universal Messiah, then all of the past traditions of Judaism now are not relevant. You should not have to become circumcised. But there were people, even during Paul's days, and one of the reasons Paul writes Galatians is that he's writing against these people called the Judaizers. There were people going into the Galatian churches at about the same time that Paul was writing, saying, if you want to be a Christian, you have to become circumcised. And Paul makes the argument, no, Jesus as the universal Messiah now a new era has dawned, and circumcision is no longer, circumcision was a very exclusive understanding of that set the Jews apart from the broader world. Now, if the broader world has been saved and redeemed by Christ, then why do we want to continue to focus on this very exclusive ritual, that makes somebody part of an exclusive group known as the Jews? So Paul goes to Jerusalem, according to Luke in the Acts of the Apostles, and according to this reference in Galatians, Paul goes to Jerusalem, and there it's decided that those who convert to Christianity, from the Gentiles who convert to Christianity, do not need to become circumcised. All well and good. Well, then another issue arose. Well, first of all, let me stop there and see if anybody has anything they want to say about that, or any clarification I can make. So it seems like a pretty good idea, right? Not having to put, especially grown men, through the ignominy as well as the utter pain of becoming circumcised, right? So Peter agrees to that. The apostles agree to that, and all is well. And they also agree that Paul will be the apostle to the Gentiles, while Peter, James, and John will be, the apostles who are working among the Jewish synagogues. After this, however, there arises a conversation, a disagreement in Antioch. Now, this is Paul going back to Antioch, and it's a similar question. Well, if a Gentile wants to convert to Christianity, Christianity with its very, very Jewish flavor, do they need to follow the Jewish laws, the kosher laws? And you might imagine Paul said no. And it was understood that at one time, Peter actually said, no, they don't need to do that. But then when he goes to Antioch, Peter goes to Antioch, he seems to ally himself with the Judaizing group. And this is where Paul gets really upset. What a hypocrite you are, Peter, because I thought you and I agreed on this, that Gentiles don't need to eat kosher. But then Peter showed himself to be really a part of what we might call the Judaizing party. And this is where the major split happens. Even Barnabas himself suggests that if a Gentile wants to become a Christian, then they have to follow the laws of kosher. Now, this just didn't involve not eating pork, right? This involved a lot of people oversimplify it by saying, well, that means the Jews don't eat pork. Well, there are a lot of things that they don't eat, and not because of for any health reasons, but because this was a practice, a ritualized practice that set them apart from the larger society. This became very, very important. Eating kosher and circumcision. In fact, many would suggest it really started at this time during the Babylonian captivity from 587 to 539 BCE, when the Israelites were taken to Babylon, and the attempt was made to assimilate them into Babylonian society. Well, they needed to come up with means to ensure that they were not going to be assimilated. So they embarked on a very, very rigorous teaching tradition, this idea of following the law, this idea of ritualizing their daily lives so as to create a very stark difference between them and the Babylonians. We circumcise our males to become part of our Jewish society. We require that people eat kosher. Those Babylonians don't. We require that there is no intermarriage between us and the Babylonians. During the Babylonian captivity, when the number of Jews was just almost, at well, no, that they were at tragic proportions, emergency proportions. They had to shore up their identity by following these very strict legalistic rules. This is the fundamentalism that Mac was talking about. But now, with the understanding of a Jewish Messiah, Paul very clearly says that exclusivism, the doors have been opened. Almost literally, the doors of the synagogue have been opened. That exclusive understanding of who you are as God's chosen people now does not, it has absolutely no meaning, because all people are God's chosen people. All people have been created in the image of God. And Paul says in Galatians, in fact, it's right after this chapter, there's no longer Jew nor Greek. There's no longer slave nor free. There's no longer male and female. There's no ethnic division. There is no class hierarchy, and there is no gender hierarchy whatsoever. So Paul was adamant about this. No, if we prescribe kosher eating for Gentiles, then we're just encouraging them to be the exclusive people that they're not meant to be, right? They're supposed to be a universally a people who recognize God's universal love for the world. So Paul and the apostles break on this. Paul himself is the one who's going to say, no, you don't need to eat kosher. All the rest of the apostles, including Barnabas as well, say, no, kosher is required. And really, the reason this was such a big issue is that a lot of times when people were eating meat in the first century, almost, I would say 100% of the time, it would be meat that would be that had been sacrificed to some sort of pagan deity. Meat as a general staple, as we often find in the United States, people weren't eating meat day in and day out. It was it was very, very rarely that they ate meat. And usually when they were eating it, it would have been sacrificed in some sort of pagan ritual. So that carries with it a taint, right? And so you could understand how the Jews wouldn't want to be eating that kind of meat. And this became a problem with Paul as well, because even some of the Gentiles that were converted were saying, well, wait a minute, should we be eating this meat that has been sacrificed to the pagans? And Paul says, try to do what's right for your conscience. If this is something that's going to cause you, to stumble in your faith or cause someone else to stumble in their faith, then, you can abstain from eating meat sacrificed to idols. But all is clean and all is available for daily consumption. You are no longer have to abide by those kosher rules. Kosher, kashrut, which simply means acceptable, and then the Jewish word for unacceptable is treif. So nothing was anymore treif. Nothing was treif any longer. Any questions or comments about that? I don't know if you've been in a situation where people are eating kosher. I had this opportunity myself. I had a fellowship at Union Seminary in New York City. And part of that fellowship involved we would eat lunch every day at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which was just a little bit down the hill and across the street. And it was the most anxiety-producing thing that's ever happened, because there are very, very strict laws. For example, you're not supposed to mix meat and dairy, right? Because of the prohibition that you must not boil a kid goat in its mother's milk. Well, after centuries of reflection on that, it has come to be understood that you should not have any kind of milk or meat product in the same vicinity with each other. you should not have milk on the same, let's say you should not have cheese on the same plate that eventually meat might be on, right? So in conservative and Orthodox households, they have two types of dinnerware. You have the meat dinnerware and you have the milk dinnerware. You have, if you have a dishwasher, if you can believe it or not, two types of dishwashers, one for meat and one for milk. And so I made the mistake of going in and actually putting, I can't remember, I had some sort of milk product. Maybe it was milk itself. And I also had, like a turkey sandwich or something like this, something that just didn't make sense to me. Oh boy, they had a police. They basically had the kosher police in that dining hall to making sure that everybody was eating the way they should. You could not take your food off of the tray and put it onto the table. You had to keep it on the tray. And very, very, what we would see is entirely legalistic. But I also, after doing that for a month, I also saw that there was a beauty to it as well. This ritual discipline that made me think about the sanctity of what I'm eating. So I don't want to just simply discount this kosher eating right out. But Paul said, this is no longer relevant. And the fact that Paul was going to say that, if you're reading the Acts of the Apostles, you will see, I think somewhere around chapter 7, that Peter, there's a story about Peter where he has this dream of this, this blanket falling from heaven, and on it were all types of morsels of food. And the voice to Peter says, "Take up and eat, Peter." And Peter says, I can't do that. There are things on here that are unlawful. And the voice says, "No, all things are lawful now." Well, that doesn't really match up with, that happens in chapter 7. But then we hear that, we hear from Paul that, Peter himself was on the kosher side of things. So another discrepancy between the way these two books are written. Any thoughts before I move on? Maybe that's a little too long a discussion, but this is a watershed moment in the history of Christianity. This is the point where really two types of Christianity are going to develop. This Jerusalem Council, and traditionally it's understood that this took place in 48 of the Common Era. One road is going to lead down the path to what we have called Jewish Christianity, where people are still following a lot of the Jewish laws and the Torah, but still claiming Jesus to be the Messiah. We know about this from the Gospel of John book that we just read. But the other path is going to take us towards a very Gentile-oriented Christianity, where a lot of the Jewish rituals are going to be lost or reinterpreted in such a way that they are no longer relevant. And it's going to be this Gentile Christianity that by 100 of the Common Era is going to be the predominant, if not the exclusive form of Christianity. And later on, it is going to be, affirmed by Constantine, and which is very, very ironic, because the Jewish Jesus and the Jewish followers of Jesus kind of get erased, kind of pushed out of the picture. And that's why many people say that Paul is the true founder of Christianity as we know it today. So a breach happens between Paul and all of the others called the apostles. And Paul goes on his way on his second missionary journey. And that is included, let me see, I'm trying to, in this map here. So down here, here's Jerusalem. Up in Antioch, they have the discussion, and Paul breaks away, and the others go on their way to their, Jewish Christian churches and Jewish Christian communities. And then Paul embarks on his second missionary journey, spends some time in Tarsus, probably sleeping on his mom and dad's couch for a little bit. And then he goes through Galatia. And I can't remember at some point, I can't remember who is it Silas? I think Silas is his companion at this time. Now, Galatia is a general region here, and we know from Acts that he makes these stops at Lystra and Antioch and Troas, but it's at Troas where he hears this call to come over and evangelize in present-day Greece. And this is where he establishes his church at Philippi, at Thessalonica, goes to Athens, has a little bit of rhetorical discourse with the philosophers there, establishes a very vibrant church at Corinth, to which he writes 2 letters, as well as he does in Thessalonica, and goes to Ephesus, and eventually, comes back to Jerusalem. But this is the journey in which these churches are established, probably happening sometime between happening sometime between 50 and 60 of the Common Era. So we're still in chapter 3, and this is what Borg and Crossan call Paul's Aegean missionary journey, and that has a pretty specific strategy to it. He would go to the capitals of the Roman provinces, to those places that had not been evangelized, and he would focus on a specific group of people that I'll introduce to you in a minute here. But what were these cities like? This is the place where Borg and Crossan give us a little bit of social background to what's happening in some of these, what we might call pagan or Roman cities. It's amazing how similar some of the class structure and the politics of Paul's day are to our current day. There is a very, very wealthy elite, that's associated with the Roman, political system, the Roman Senate, the aristocrats, right? And then you have, kind of a military class, but then you have an urban working class, which were the majority of the people. And they were very, very diverse in and of themselves. Some of them, probably most of them, were illiterate, but some of them could probably read. So it's like the diversity of our middle class and working class and middle class even today. They would have lived in, because this was a very militaristic era, as all of human history seems to have been. They would live in walled cities, and they would be very, very densely populated. And Borg and Crossan bring out this case study of what the density of the population must have been. This Antioch case study, and this is the Antioch that we were talking about, probably 117 people per acre is what we're talking about, living inside of these walled cities. So they're pretty much living on top of each other. And it's very similar to the population density of New York City today. But remember, New York City has got people living in, sky-high skyscrapers. They go up, 100 stories or so. But these folks were probably living no higher than 5 stories high. So, you can imagine this is probably a pretty smelly place to live, very, very densely populated, very much like, today's, very urban centers. Another thing to keep in mind that I think is really similar to what we are going through, the bigger the empire got, and the more, this idea of bringing peace and prosperity to the empire became part of the Roman, talking points, you might say. part of the Roman mythology, the more that they saw that they had to really commercialize agriculture. Instead of having a bunch of 100 small farmers on 100 acres producing, their small amount, they displaced those workers from the land. And then pretty much, the land was sold, or more times than not, stolen by the aristocratic class and put into production by the slave class. Well, that left a lot of displaced workers, and those displaced workers start finding their way into the cities. And then the issue becomes, how do we feed all these people, and how do we keep them from revolting, right? I mean, because there's a lot of population in one place, all you have to do is light that match, and before you know it, the tinder has been completely consumed. So how do we keep them, satisfied? Well, this is where the whole policy of bread and circus came into the equation. You keep them nominally fed, or just reasonably fed, and you keep them entertained, right? And that will keep them dependent upon you enough that they will not want to lose even that modicum of comfort that they have in their lives. And every time I think about this, I'm thinking that this is almost transferable on a one-to-one basis into what we have today. Keep them entertained with 58 or 100 or however many channels you've got in your cable TV, and keep them cheaply fed with highly processed foods that are subsidized by the government, right? This is what was happening, and so the potential for revolution was great, and Morgenstern would want to make the point that what Paul was doing was going to be revolutionary. And this is going to have its effect, several decades down the line here. Paul was really embarking on a revolution, not a military revolution, not a violent revolution, but a revolution that was subversive all the same. So, subversive to whom, I should say? Well, first of all, it was going to be subversive to the synagogues, to the Jews. We know that Paul was always upsetting the Jews, right? Then it was going to be subversive to the Roman Empire as well. Two enemies on the front there. So who was it then that Paul was getting to revolt, you might say? And I use that term advisedly. We're not talking about militaristic revolt. We're talking about a change of worldview that is going to completely upset, or stand on its head, that the Roman hierarchy as it was known. Well, we know from Luke, and this is where Luke kind of gets it wrong, that Paul, when he would go into the cities, the first stop he would make would be in the synagogues. And this creates kind of a little bit of conflict here, because we just heard that Paul was going to be the apostle to the Gentiles. If that's the case, why would he go to the synagogues? That's Jewish territory. And this is where this book has been very, very helpful for me. When I first read it, I thought, this makes perfect sense. Because even I, back in my high school days, when I was reading the Acts of the Apostles, I thought, okay, he goes to the synagogues, but I thought he's, the apostle to the Gentiles. He must be, setting up a base in the synagogue and then going out to the Gentiles. No, that's not what he was doing. He was going to the synagogues because the synagogues held in their communities a certain number of what were known as righteous Gentiles, or God-fearing or God-worshiping Gentiles. And these are even referred to obliquely in the Acts of the Apostles and in Paul's letters. when he gives greetings to those who are God worshipers. And this was this was not an uncommon practice, that the synagogue had kind of a two-class system. First of all, you had the devout, observant Jews, and then in a larger circle, you might have those on the outskirts who were Gentiles, who were attracted to the moral trajectory or the moral beliefs of Judaism, but they weren't going to go full bore into becoming, getting circumcised and becoming Jews themselves. They felt, well, much like some people do in Christianity today, they want to follow the Christian principles, but they don't want to go to church, right? They will follow Christian principles to a T, but they don't want to go full bore and become baptized in the church and become part of the church community. It's a little bit like that. And we know from inscriptions, and this is from a synagogue inscription in a place known as Aphrodisias in Turkey from the 1st century. Borg and Crossan say that, if you read this inscription, 43% of the names on it, and these are people who, gave money for the building, we still do this today. These are people who gave money for the building of the synagogue. 43% of those people were Gentiles. So to assume that the Jews were highly exclusive in, especially in these non-Judean areas, but, in these predominantly Gentiles areas, to presume that they were highly exclusive is a misunderstanding. There was this gray area where you had Gentiles worshiping in the synagogues, giving their money to the synagogues, recognizing and worshiping the one God, but not going the full step into to Judaism. And so Borg and Crossan say, if Paul went to the synagogues, then it was for a particular reason, and it was to appeal to these Gentiles, these God worshipers, these God-fearers. Because now, and it's a beautiful strategy, because everything was in place, except they themselves were not going to start, eat kosher and then become circumcised. And then all of a sudden, Paul comes in with this message: hey, guess what? If you affirm in your faith this new Jewish Messiah, this Jewish Messiah, Jesus, you don't have to follow those laws. You don't have to eat kosher. You don't have to become circumcised, but you can still, abide by, the moral ethos of what it means to be a Jew. Well, that's a problem, right? If you're a Jewish rabbi and you see 43% of your synagogue saying, "You're kidding me. Oh, well, this sounds really good. Tell us more about this Jesus. What do I need to do?" Well, instead of circumcision, you become baptized. Oh, well, what's the baptism involved? Just a little bit of water, dunk your head, and then, you affirm your faith in Jesus. Well, that's a lot easier than circumcision. And the Jewish, moral tradition is still foundational. Absolutely, Paul says. What about eating kosher? The only eating we do, Paul says, is the Lord's Supper, breaking of the bread and drinking the wine. I love bread and wine. Can you see the marketing strategy here? I hate to, put it in such mundane terms. This is why the Jews were getting upset with Paul. He was stealing people from their synagogues. He was stealing their benefactors. And so this is Borg and Crossan's thesis here. And this is on page 86, if therefore Paul went, as in Luke Acts, to convert Jews in the synagogue, he was disobeying his missionary mandate from God and contradicting his own understanding of his destiny. This was the insight that I had when I was, even in high school. Wait a minute, why is he going to synagogues if he's a missionary, excuse me, why is he going to the synagogues if he's the missionary to the Gentiles? Then secondly, page 87, our conclusion is that Paul could never have begun in each city by going to the synagogue to convert Jews to Christian Judaism. But he could have gone to the synagogues to do something else, something more in keeping with his divine mandate at Damascus and his human mandate at Jerusalem. Who are those Gentiles to whom Paul went? And it's precisely this group known as the righteous Gentiles, the God-fearers, the God worshippers. He even names one of them, Lydia, in Acts chapter 16, after whom our Lydia room in the church is named. She was a seller of fine purple, a very royal color at the time, and presumably had a lot of money, right? But she was one of these God-fearers as well. So this is Paul's audience, and this is Paul's strategy. Go to the unevangelized provincial capitals and do what's called adherent preaching. These are people who had already adhering to much of what was found attractive in Judaism. And then preach to them this new Messiah and what it takes to become part of this Christian movement. So Paul's communities were usually very small, and Borgencrossen talk about shop churches. Paul was involved with what was called a tent making ministry. When we say a tent, he used to make awnings basically, and it was in that capacity that he had the opportunity to evangelize as well. But they weren't meetings in the synagogues because for the most part, he wasn't welcome in the synagogues. So how did they meet? They usually would meet in the shops where, these urban working class people, practice their craft, or they would meet in house churches a little bit later on. If you were poor, you would meet in groups of 10 or 12 in a shop. We don't really know, but it's inferences that Paul makes. But if you were wealthy, what we do know from archaeological evidence is that people were converting their houses into churches. And this came to be known as the house church model, where more and more people could come and gather together. And there's, again, once again, archaeology helps us with this. Now, this wasn't during Paul's day, but it was during the first part of the 3rd century. There was a dig done around the time of World War I in a place called Dura Europos in present-day Syria. If you can see my pointer on the map, this city was about right here on the Euphrates River in present-day Syria. And archaeologists estimate that this house was converted from a regular dwelling to a church. Now imagine, here's the floor plan. And imagine that over top of here, there's kind of an upside down U shape. There was a second floor. But on the first floor, what used to be the first floor of the house, they would take out a wall that was usually right here, that was once maybe a meeting room, a bedroom or something, and then opened up this 2-room area into an area known as assembly hall, from which a person would read, perhaps one of Paul's letters or read something from this pedestal, which later comes to be known as our pulpit. The street would be over here on our right, and you would enter here and come into this open area, this open court from this portico. And then this was an area that was converted into a room, what we might call a Sunday school class, where you learn about the faith. And then you would become baptized in this room that was converted into a baptistry. where you would have this font and area where you could baptize people in full baptism. And this really matches up with what we know from a book called the Didache, which was really probably written right around from the same area, that talks about how you bring people into the faith, and you pray with them, you fast with them, you teach them the catechism, and then on Easter they become baptized, and then they become full adherents, welcome to eat the Lord's Supper in this assembly hall here. This is the movement that would have begun with Paul. Or I should say, this is the movement that would have been reflective of the kind of ministry that Paul was doing in his missionary area of Asia Minor and Greece and in Greece, and then eventually in Rome as well. So that brings us almost to the end. You've been a very quiet group today. Thank you for listening to me. Do you have any questions or comments about this?
Dan?
Yeah, Danny.
Oregon Crossing have drawn largely for their data on the demographics on Rodney Stark's Rise of Christianity, and it's well worth your read. I recommend it. Rodney Stark is a sociologist and a theologian at the University of Washington, and just wanted to throw that in. If people are interested in getting a sociologist look at this information.
Yeah, and he's the one who establishes that population density in Antioch.
Yes.
Did you ever use that book? How do you know the book, Denny?
I picked it up. I think it used to belong to John Harrington, actually.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes perfect sense.
John gave it to me years ago.
Great. Any other comments? Well, we're getting close to the end of chapter 3 here. So when we return next time, we're going to begin with chapter 4 and a really interesting question. If you've already read the chapter, you know that some of the attributions that we make of Jesus, that he was God and Lord and Savior and the Prince of Peace, and all of these, some very exalted images that we have, they were on the lips of Romans well before they were on the lips of Christians, because this was how the great Caesars, especially Caesar Augustus, were described to the people: God of God, Son of God, bringer of peace, goodwill towards all. And so the question we're going to be investigating is, what is the difference between the Roman imperial theology that claims that Caesar is God, Lord, Savior? What's the difference between that theology and the Christian theology that claims that Jesus is God, Lord, Savior, bringer of peace? And this is where things get pretty interesting. But at the conclusion of chapter 4, you'll begin to see just how subversive, at least on a sociological level, this Christian movement really is, because it's taking the vocabulary of the dominant culture and turning it on its head and creating a new mythology, so to speak, a new worldview, a new way of using this terminology that's not associated with some of the debauched Caesars that we know about. So, well, thank you. I've probably kept you long enough. I appreciate you coming in today.
Thank you.
I'm still having fun. I hope you are too.
Good stuff, Dan.
Yeah, I think so too. Well, let's keep our eye on what's happening in Jerusalem and Israel, and we'll probably check in next time. So I will see you all, whether in church or in town or wherever. Or Joyce, not you, but I'll see you next week. So, and you too, Al. I'll see you later. Bye.